this. So that way we have it. All right. So let's dive in to the great space known as, yeah, I know it's old. Okay. The great space here as we talk about agency, right? And as we talk about what that kind of looks like, we've spent a fair amount of time on this. The reason, again, I picked this one is that it's the first one and it always matters. So that's why we're going to talk about it. Again, I always have to count my zeros, so that's on me. All right, so let's log in. Oh yeah, this was kind of a funny thing, right? They had this new security thing all launched, and now they're coming back saying, oh, sorry, we're not going to do it this year. Come on, you guys. Not a very exciting piece, but that's okay. All right, so jumping into tools, and let's get into here. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning.
All righty. My demo, agency relationships. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is back up. I had a couple really good questions that came up specifically around facilitation. So I'm going to, I want to re-hit this section right here. There is, and I was trying to figure this out, and I realized I misspoke in the last coffee and contracts thing, and so I want to try to clear this up. The facilitation deal, when I said you cannot facilitate both sides of the transaction, what I meant by that is you can't facilitate while you're in a representation contract. Okay, so you can facilitate, okay, a buy side, and you can facilitate a sell side in the same transaction. Okay, so you can facilitate both sides of the transaction, but you may not facilitate when one of those parties is under contract. And I realized I had a couple of questions following, and I watched the video and I went, I was not clear, so I'm going to try to be clear today. If you are in a situation where you're doing an open house for somebody else, you by default in that situation, if it's not your listing, you still represent the seller. Okay, so if somebody walks into the door and says, hey, I'd like to write an offer, they have one option at that point. Dual agents, well, I take it back, they have two options. Dual agency, because you could sign them as a buyer and then you could run them through the contract in a dual agency situation. Or two, they can be unrepresented and we can still write the contract on behalf of the seller because that's who we represent, okay? You are not legally able to facilitate on behalf of that individual because you already have representation. You are already representing the seller, even though it's not your direct client, it's still at the brokerage level, okay? Now, on the other side of the coin, you walk into a for sale by owner with a buyer who you have under contract. Maybe, and it's the same thing. It could be your direct client, or it could be, hey, I'm helping Lucas out over the weekend by taking one of his clients to an open house, okay? Or a for sale by owner, because that's what the time frame works. So I'm taking one of Lucas's clients to go look at a for sale by owner because that's what the schedule allows, or Lucas is taking his client to go look at this for sale by owner. That for sale by owner is unrepresented, right? So at this point, that individual, the seller has, again, two options. Number one, you can sign a listing contract with them and represent them as a seller in a dual agency capacity. That would be option one. Option two would be they don't need any representation and you continue to represent your buyer to the fullest ability. Now that still means, again, that still means that you write the offer. It still means you advocate and advise your client. You do not advocate and advise the seller. It's simply, here's the offer. Let us know what you think. And if they say, well, can you walk us through it? Starts to get into a scary situation there, but the answer is yes, because it's in the best interest of your buyer to walk them through that offer. And if they start to say, well, what do you think we should do? The answer is, I can't do that. I don't represent you. If you would like representation in our advice and counsel, you can sign this form and I'd be happy to provide that to you in a dual agency capacity. If they say, well, we just want you to do the paperwork, not going to happen. Well, we just want you to put it in MLS. Not going to happen, right? Because that's all facilitator services. So because you already have a buyer under contract in this situation, whether it's Lucas's direct buyer or I'm showing a for sale by owner to Lucas's clients on behalf of the company and the brokerage, it all ties into Coldwell Banker Crown. So That's where you cannot have a facilitation agreement on one side and then a representation on the other side. The situation that has occurred a lot this year, right, is, and I think I used this one, right? So grandma and grandpa want to sell to grandson, want to sell the house, right? In that situation, you can have a facilitation agreement on one side and do the deal, right? Because you're simply just facilitating with one client, or you can have a facilitation agreement on two sides. Okay, you can have a facilitation and a facilitation agreement in that situation. Now, normally I don't do that because one facilitation agreement is, in my opinion, is sufficient. Now, if you change the terms of what you're doing under the facilitation agreement, you could alter that. And I know Anthony and I were having a conversation about this, and he brought up a really good point, which I didn't think of. But he told me he likes to get a facilitation agreement on both sides right away. I don't normally do that, but what he told me I thought was wise, because he said usually what ends up happening along the way is, maybe you're filling out paperwork and you're getting it to the title company. That's your services you're doing on the sell and the buy side. And he said, it allows me, if the buyer comes to me and says, hey, I would like additional services, you can now amend that facilitation agreement without having to amend the contract, which is different from what I've done. And frankly, I think actually smarter. And same thing with the seller side. If the seller says, hey, can we add on to the facilitation services agreement? You can do that for just the seller side, right? The seller services agreement. And you can amend that along with the services and the compensation without having to amend the contract. And so when he explained that to me, I thought, that's actually a pretty wise way to look at that. I haven't had that happen much, but as we were talking through it, I was going, well, if somebody's going to come to you and say, hey, can you help us? Yep. $1,000, 500, whatever you're doing the fees for, I can see how that would be beneficial, because now you have the ability to flex on your servicing for each client, depending upon what they need and what they want. So I thought that was pretty wise. And frankly, it's probably going to change how I do facilitation moving forward. I'll probably have, and this happens, it happened a lot on the front side of the year, right? Hey, we just need somebody to do the paperwork. We already found a buyer. Shoot, see darn. Okay, right? So then we can come in and we can say, all right, I'll get a facilitation on the seller side. Buyer, if you would like my help facilitating the services here's the fees, and away we go. And then throughout the transaction, if things change, then you have the opportunity to have that conversation about increasing your services and increasing your compensation. So again, I think I didn't explain that well last time, so I wanted to try to clear that up this time. Does anybody have any questions?
Is there a facilitator form for the buyer side and then a different one for the seller?
That's a great question.
Are they the same?
Great question. Let's jump back. Let's just look real quick, because instead of me, I want to say there is, but let's just go take a peek. Facilitator. Yeah, so there's a buyer, tenant, and then an owner, seller, tenant. Yep, or owner leasing. Sorry, if you were to do that. So yes, there is. So then you could use the buyer form on the buy side, seller form on the sell side. Very rarely are you guys going to probably get into tenant negotiations where you're facilitating. Maybe you are. If you got a commercial tenant that says, hey, can you help us with the lease? Sure. We can do that. And then you could do that here. So yes, Danny, there are multiple forms. There used to only be one form. Fun factoid. Now there's multiples. Other questions? Okay. So again, I just wanted to try to be really clear on that. The facilitator, I'm just going to highlight it again. If any one of the parties is under a full representation contract, you cannot sign a facilitation agreement with anybody else in that agreement. Okay. If the parties come to you and there's no representation, you can sign a facilitation. Again, I've never really done it in the past, although again, moving forward, I think Anthony brought a good point that, there's probably some value there. In that relationship. And again, maybe it's just how, he explains it versus how I explain it. But either way, I like the ability to flex the contract in order to move forward with that. So I thought that was pretty cool. So there you go. That's the update and the little correction I wanted to make sure that I gave you guys the best information possible moving forward. All right. All right, so the last little chunk here that we're going to talk about today is the old car or the LC Dora, depending upon when you took your classes, okay? So before we get into the fiduciary obligation, I'm going to jump down to this section right here. The predatory offender notice here. So this is a super fun part of the conversation because it shows up on every single form when we get the ability to explain to people that why we're telling them where to go. So notice against predatory offenders. Information regarding the predatory offender registry or persons registered with the predatory offender registry under Minnesota Statute 243-166 may be obtained by local law enforcement in the community where the property is located or the Minnesota Department of Corrections. And you can do a phone call or you could visit their website to do a last known address search. Now, this is where I think it's super dumb, but this is the law, right? If you go into a property and you know that, hey, I just saw the paper. One of the neighbors called me, when we put the sign up or whatever, and said, hey, just so you know, we have a sexual offender moving into the neighborhood, right? Because wherever a sexual offender moves, they're required to register that with the Department of Corrections. I want to say Department of Commerce, but it's Department of Corrections, actually. And then, notices get issued and published. And so sometimes neighbors take it upon themselves to let you know that information. The sad part is that we can't hand that information over because that's considered discrimination. And if we want to talk about this on a non-recorded opportunity, you can hear my real opinion about how I don't care. But that's the law, right? So we don't get the ability to hand a potential buyer, right? So if we're working with a young family, first time house, and they're buying in a sub 200 neighborhood or whatever, and that the only place in town that allows predator offenders to live is, over in this crappy rundown hotel thing. And they're going to buy right next door to it. You can't hand them the registry list and the information, as dumb as that is, which is why it's located on every single form that we have. What you can do is simply remind them that they have the right legally in the state of Minnesota to contact the Department of Corrections and learn about this information. So all you can do is continuously highlight this information if you know of anything. It is part of my process when I'm working with buyers to do a search, and I don't care how old or young or whatever. Because if there's somebody nearby, I like to make sure that people know, right? And like in Alec, for instance, where I primarily operate out of, I know that there are only about 3 or 4 places in town where sexual offenders are actually permitted to live by the property owners, okay? And so it's a small subset areas of town, and if people start to buy or look at buying something close to there, I'll always have it on my internal checklist. All right, we're gonna do a registry search, and I'm gonna find out where these people are. And if they... all I can do is encourage people to go do the search, right? Just like you can't, when somebody says, hey, is this a safe neighborhood? Well, you and I have different definitions of safe, right? And so that's where we don't get the ability to say, oh yeah, it's totally safe. Nope. You get to say, well, you know what? Safe's a relative term. I would encourage you to contact the local PD and, get a crime report, get a history of the neighborhood, drive around during, the evening time and the weekends and see what kind of activity you see and see if you're comfortable with it. So we don't get to define that. Same thing as we don't get to share with people, well, here's the predator's information. All we can do is say, please go do a search. And sometimes that's as simple as, please go do a search. And 9 times out of 10, people are smart enough to understand that they need to go do the search. And sometimes, some people will even just do it right on their phone, right when we're in the property or we're heading to the property. And I've had people call and cancel showings because they did this on a property. So it is a real deal. Any questions on the predatory offender information notice? It's pretty cut and dry. The thing that I teach on this a lot, though, is basically just to make sure, if you put yourself in the buyer's shoes, right? Right. So I have 4 kids, 7, 5, 3, and 1. I think most of you know, right? 3 girls. This would be something I would really care about, So it's something that I think maybe I'm overly cautious about it, but it's just kind of how I process things. So again, it's on all the forms. It's on this one. It's on the buyer rep. It's on the seller. It's on the listing contract. It's in the PA. It's all over the charts. So you can't miss it, and hopefully you don't miss it. Now, LC Dora, fiduciary obligations. I'm going to start with the easy one first. Confidentiality, okay? So what happens here is confidentiality is given the fact that you will keep the client's confidences, right, unless required by law to disclose specific information, such as material facts. So this means, you remember, the default relationship in the state of Minnesota is a facilitator, okay? The default role in the state of Minnesota is a facilitation agreement, which means the only fiduciary obligation, and I always tell people fiduciary is a fancy word which means I'm legally obligated, okay? I'm legally obligated to give you confidentiality by being a licensed salesperson in the state of Minnesota. Okay, so when you and I talk about something, I don't get to share it with anybody. I don't get to talk about it. In small towns, it's hard because your signs in the yard, or people talk, or they post pictures, or whatever, and they start to say, well, you know what? We know you're working with them. How's it going? You know what? I can't tell you. I'm sorry. You'd have to ask them, right? Which is really hard at times, because especially when it's somebody you love and care about, and you're super excited that they get to finally buy a house, and they finally found one, right, after a crazy year. You just want to scream it from the rooftops that you're super stoked for your client, but you can't. You get to sit there being, poised and reserved, and just simply saying, well, you would have to ask them about it. I'm bound by confidentiality that I'm not at liberty to discuss. People are like, what? I'm like, yeah, it's straight up truth, man. It's like client-attorney privilege. That's just the way it's going to work. So confidentiality, anything as it relates, again, price, terms, motivation, any of that information is held confidential. And truthfully, that's the high level stuff of what we're talking about here. Some people take it to the next level, like, well, they can't even talk about what type of dog they have. Well, really, this is indicative of meaning only price, terms, and motivation, right? Stuff that can be used adversely against you in the negotiations. However, it's not a bad idea just to maintain confidentiality through the whole thing. And again, this continues to go on, minus the disclosure of material facts to buyers. So if the seller says, yeah, you know what though, we get water in the basement every spring at this place, but we don't want you to tell anybody that. Nope, sorry. That's a material fact I have to. My confidentiality is not bound to that. And if they say, well, we want you to do that, the answer is no. And if they say, well, we're going to hire somebody else, you say, that's great. Go find somebody else. And now you walk away, and then most of the time they come back and they say, well, all right, fine, I guess we'll disclose it, because that's usually what happens. Anyway, I digress. All right, so this disclosure, back up to line 61, this disclosure is required by law in any transaction involving property occupied or intended to be occupied by 1 to 4 families at their residence. So again, this is that, when does this form come out? We talked about this day one, 1 to 4 intended to be occupied. So if somebody's buying this as a duplex, technically, legally, you don't have to give this form, because they're not going to occupy it. However, it's not a bad idea just to have it in file, right? Sound like an attorney. There's never a problem with too many forms. That's kind of true. CYA, right? That's what you're after here. But the fiduciary duties, so if you enter into a listing, seller relationship, buyer relationship, or dual agency, then you get put into the situation here, right? So you get fiduciary obligations. We're going to start talking about loyalty. Loyalty is meaning you and the brokerage will act only in the client's best interest, okay? This is ultimately, you're talking about no matter what you're doing, you're not doing anything to the detriment of that client, okay? Obedience, broker, salesperson will carry out all clients' lawful wishes. Lawful wishes, okay? The big one here, a lot of times people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, if somebody says they don't want the property shown between 2 and 4, don't show the property between 2 and 4. They don't like the projected list price that you came up with. They want it $45,000 higher. Okay, well, that's legal. Maybe you advise them differently. Now you got to decide if that's a large enough swing in a margin that you can negotiate down, or are you going to leave it and move on, right? So it's a lawful instruction. Disclosure, right? You will disclose to clients all material facts of which you've become made aware of that might reasonably affect the client's use and enjoyment of the property. That's that material fact definition, right? Anything that could adversely affect an ordinary purchaser's use and enjoyment of the property. Confidentiality, which we covered. Reasonable care, right? You will use reasonable care in performing duties as an agent. Reasonable care, basically making sure that you're showcasing them in the best light possible, right? So, if you're gonna be presenting offers on behalf of, making sure you do it in a professional, organized way. This can even, in my opinion, this even comes down to, making sure that you are dressed appropriately, making sure you're clean, making sure you're tidy, making sure that your email is, spell checked beforehand, making sure that you're taking care of your text messages and not trying to send too much or accidentally send the wrong photo to somebody, right? So like all of these things, in my opinion, come into reasonable care. And then lastly, accounting. So we will account for the client's money and property received as an agent. Now, this one, some people say, well, I get that, earnest money on a buy side, but what about the sell side? Well, the sell side, anything that you could receive money and property, right? So that could be keys, that could be door lock codes, that could be abstracts, right? So there's a lot of any property that's being surrendered to you, we now have to have an account for, right? So like abstracts as an example would be, you start to look at, what does it look like when the abstract comes in, right? Did you take a photocopy and have somebody sign it indicating that it's now in your possession? Did you hand it off to the title company and get a receipt that it's now in their possession? Can you prove the chain of custody on that thing so that you don't have to pay for it in the end? Same thing with the keys. I'm not a huge fan of combo lock boxes because we don't know when somebody is going into them. Now, with people in their security systems and that becoming more of a trend, it's a little bit easier. So if somebody's got a security camera on the property, it's pretty easy to say, well, I know when somebody's going to access that lockbox. Great. Well, let me put the lockbox, this combo lockbox, in a place that camera covers, right? So we know when somebody accesses it if there's ever an issue. The super lock boxes, in SentriLock and, the electronic lock boxes, I should say, are so much easier because now you actually get an email, right? You get a record, you can log into the portal and see what key card, what code opened the box, when did they shut it, and you get all that information coming back. So it's a full accounting. And lastly here, if the seller elects not to agree to dual agency, seller may give up their opportunity to sell the property to buyers represented by the broker or the salesperson. If the buyer agrees not to, they gave up the opportunity to purchase properties listed by the broker. And this is kind of that disclosure section right here, right? That's saying if you choose not to allow us to do dual agency, this is the ramifications of that. Totally fine, but just so you know, this is what that's going to mean. Okay, so that's an important spot to cover too. Any questions on fiduciary obligations? All right, seeing none, I'm going to clear this. And then here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to walk you through my presentation of this. And then if somebody else wants to give a presentation of how you do it, that would be super cool. Okay. So if I'm going to sit down with you, and what do you want to be, a buyer or a seller today? Somebody just has to tell me buyer or seller. I don't care.
Buyer.
Thank you very much. All right. So coming at you as a buyer, right? So we say, all right, you guys. So this is the funny thing that happens here. We have now met. This is our second time meeting. Okay. We seem to like each other enough to where we're going to work together. But before we officially secure our relationship, right, as a buyer and your super awesome real estate agent, Brandon, Minnesota law requires me to share this form with you. And the reason I'm doing this is because I like my job. And in case you're a spy with the Department of Commerce, I want to make sure I'm doing my job to keep my license. Okay. So bear with me for a couple minutes as I walk this thing through. Okay. So the first thing I need to talk to you about here is, I'm going to get my arrow out. Again, this is a Minnesota law requires thing. Okay. So this has nothing to do with me, you. This is just Minnesota law requires that early on in a relationship, I disclose to you the different ways you can hire me as a real estate broker. Okay. Now, the one thing I want to make sure you know too, that this is a disclosure only, not a contract for representation. Okay. So we're going to sign this. I'm going to ask you to sign this form today, like my previous email said, but this doesn't bind us together. Next time we see each other, then we'll have that conversation. But for today, this is me just doing my job as the Minnesota law requires. Okay. So as we go through this, you're going to see that there's a couple ways that we can do this. Number one is a seller-broker relationship. So what this means is if you had a property in which you wanted me to come in and list for you and help you market and help you get the most amount of money for, then I would have the opportunity to do that by coming in and acting as a seller broker. So we would enter into a listing contract. Okay. The other thing that we're going to do in the primary relationship that we're talking about with what you've told me is most likely looking at a buyer's broker relationship. Now, this would be where we're going to enter into, as I said, next time we meet, we're going to enter into this agreement that binds us together, right? I'm with you and you're with me, almost like a covenant relationship. It's kind of like a marriage, but with a really quick dissolution policy, okay? So this is where we get an opportunity to work with one another, right, in a full fiduciary way. And I'm going to explain to you what fiduciary means in a couple minutes, okay? Then the next thing that you can do, let me get rid of my annotation. Sorry, I got to scroll down. The next thing that we can do here is looking at your dual agency. So dual agency could exist in this situation. So let's say you guys decide that you like me enough to let me work for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to sign that relationship. But then what can also happen is you might also look at listings by me, by any one of the people that I work with, by our brokerage, right? And in that situation, I have an obligation to represent the seller as well as you, my buyer. So when we go through this, this is what's known as dual agency. The big thing that you want to understand with dual agency is that I can't do anything to your detriment or the seller's detriment. Okay. So an example that would be is you really like this home, you know, that one of my colleagues has listed 4 blocks down, and it's super cool. It's absolutely perfect. And you go, hey, Brandon, how low do you think they'll actually go? Like, will they take 20 grand less? And my response is going to be, that's super cool. I have no idea, and I can't advise you on that. If you want to try 20 grand lower, let's do it. That's totally fine. And same thing, if the seller comes to me and says, hey, Brandon, we know that you're bringing the buyer here. Listen, we're 20 grand off. How much higher do you think they're going to go? My response to the seller at that point is going to be, you know what? I don't know. Send back your best counter offer. So in a normal situation where dual agency isn't, I might be able to advise you a little bit in that, but I don't want to do anything to the detriment of either buyer or seller when it comes to dual agency. Okay. Any questions on that, or does that one kind of make sense? Right. And then I nod, they nod, and we move on. The next thing that you're going to do is we're going to talk about this facilitation agreement. Okay. So let's just say you are going to buy your grandma's house. You get so tired of looking at properties and you want to buy grandma's house. Totally cool. Grandma probably, doesn't want to list the house, doesn't want to take photos, doesn't want to get everything squared up. So in that situation, then what we want to do is probably just do a facilitation agreement. Now, I can still come in and fully represent you in this transaction because we'll probably be in that type of a relationship. So I'll come in, I'll write the contracts, and we'll take care of it. Not a problem. But let's say, tomorrow you come to me and you want to buy grandma's house. Well, that's fine. I can still help you with the whole process and still get compensated for my time, skills, and efforts, and you still get the house that you want. Now, in this event, the only fiduciary obligation I'm going to owe you is confidentiality, meaning I'm going to take care of anything in that you've shared with me, and it's going to stay between me and you, and it doesn't go anywhere. Now, remember that fancy word fiduciary, right? We talked about. So here's what I'm going to walk you through that. This next section is going to share with you the fiduciary obligations that I am a licensed broker have to share with you. Okay. So I'm legally required to help you. Okay. And give you these services. So I'm legally required to give you loyalty, meaning I'm only going to act in your best interest, right? I'm not going to talk smack about you behind the back or at the coffee shop. I'm going to talk nothing about great things about you and making sure that your best interest is top of mind at all times. Obedience, anything that I do that you ask me to do that's legal, and I always add ethically, okay? So if it's legal and ethical, I have to do it. A prime example would be on the buy side, if you come at me and you say, hey, you know what? I really want to include all of this personal property that I saw, that boat and the Ferrari in the garage. I'd really like to do that with my offer that's $50,000 less. Well, I might disagree with you and advise you differently to help you win the house that you're ultimately trying to get. But is it legal? Yep. Is it ethical? Yep. Therefore, we do it. Even though I may advise you differently, I'm still obligated to do that. Disclosure. I've been doing this a long time, you guys. One of the best benefits about using me and a larger brokerage is the amount of knowledge that we have going into this property. If I know anything that's a material fact, right, I have to share that with you. I've been in a lot of houses. I've seen a lot of houses. I know a lot about, well, this neighborhood floods because the drain tile's wrong and the road went in incorrectly, right? Or we know that, this particular part of town was a filled in swamp, right? So I know all this information that I'm going to be able to share with you and bring you some massive value. Confidentiality, remember we already talked about that one. That says anything we talk about stays between you, me, and the fence post. Reasonable care. This basically says that anything I do on your behalf, I do it in a way that showcases you in the best light possible. Okay. And then lastly, accounting. When you give me that first check of earnest money, remember we talked about that at the buyer consultation, that earnest money check, that first dollar amount that you're going to give me, I'm going to make sure that I have an accurate record of how we're going to spend that money moving forward. Okay. So now, again, if you choose to enter into a relationship, most likely what we're going to do is agree to dual agency. And in that situation, know that we're going to have full opportunities to get all of these things, all of these fiduciary obligations represented to you. But it may be a little bit different as we scroll down. So last thing here, again, is just a predatory offender notice. You know, we've talked about this one before, but if you are interested in knowing where any sexual offenders are in the area next to a property, you may or may not be interested. You have a right to know that by Minnesota Statute 243. You can contact them at this phone number here or the web address down at the bottom and do a last known address search. Do you have any questions on this form? And if so, I would love to answer them. Otherwise, I'm just going to ask you to go ahead and sign and date right here for me on line 13, indicating again that I have covered this disclosure only, and we're not signing a contract for representation. We'll do that next time we meet. So mine's a little longer than some people's, right? I know some people who can like whip this thing out in about like a minute and a half. Mine took me 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Because I timed it. That being said, that's how I do it, right? The sell side is going to have a little bit of a different flavor to it because obviously you're going to probably spend more time on the seller broker side, so on and so forth. One of the big things they tell us all the time is when you go through this, you'll notice I use the arrow, right, to kind of walk people. So that's me basically using my pen, right, and just pointing to different sections on the paper, because what you don't want to do is circle something. If you circle anything, basically you do not want to write on this form. That's the bottom line, because what happens is, and we have case studies to prove this, what happens is if you circle the seller broker relationship and then they sign it, sometimes the client or the customer at this point assumes this is the relationship that they're in. And usually it's the buyer side one where they come through and they say, well, what do you mean? We signed that form, right? That means we're in this, right? You should have represented me. You should have let me know that property was coming. And then you get into lawsuit after lawsuit, and there is actual stories and litigation that says because the agent circled something on this form and they signed it, there was a no or a potential liability of obligation to represent, which I thought was crazy, but that's a real thing. So basically, don't mark the form, right? Hand them the form, sign the form, get the form back, right? Hand them the form, have them sign it, get it back, and either take a photo of it, scan it with, many of the scanner apps on your phone. That's usually what I do. Scan it as a PDF, and then I just give it back to them, and away we go. So that's agency. What kind of questions you guys got?
Brandon, what if somebody is super against dual agency? What if they're like, no, I don't want to agree to that? What would you say?
Yeah. So my first question would be is, you obviously had a bad experience with a bad agent. That would be my response to that. Tell me about that experience. What happened? And if they say, well, it's just terrible, I'm not doing it. That's totally fine, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. You have full right to representation how you want it. Now, just so you know, with a company of our size, you're going to miss out on the ability to, look at some properties with me as your primary agent. And if that's the way you want it, that's what we can do. I can connect you with a really great agent at ABC Realty who can serve as a backup to represent you on our transactions. So that's what I would do. And then in the buyer, you would have to sign a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement or a non-exclusive listing agreement, which most people don't like to do because you just go, why, right? So on the buy side, it would be a non-exclusive. On the sell side, you would still sign a full listing contract, and then you would just probably send a referral out to ABC Realty. So you pick one of your friends at a different brokerage and say, hey, I got a lead for you. I want a 30% referral fee. I've nurtured the thing, and they want to write the offer, but they don't like dual agency. And eventually somebody's going to be happy enough to take that. So that's normally what I would do. It's rare that somebody doesn't want dual agency in residential, but sometimes it does come up. Other questions? Okie dokie. Well, there is the agency form. Surprisingly, it took 3 sessions to do it, but that's totally fine. If you have a form that you would like to see gone over, feel free to email me or whatever. I'm happy to share that with you, and we'll get that on the docket next. So we'll be back next Monday, 9 o'clock again, going through a form. And again, the whole point of this is kind of that high-level detail piece just to see where we can land. So if you guys got any questions, you know where to find me. If you got feedback or again, a forum, feel free to call, text, chat, whatever, and it'll be a great time. So hope you guys have an awesome day. We will see you soon. Bye-bye.